Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on, well, one of the most fundamental challenges, really, in criminology and, frankly, all of social science.
Absolutely. It's this enduring question.
Yeah, understanding why some individuals commit crimes, not just, once, but persistently, why they build what we actually call a criminal career.
Right. We're not talking about just a single mistake or a bad choice here.
No, exactly. We're looking at the whole developmental arc, how this behavior starts, the onset, how it continues, sometimes for decades.
And then, crucially, what makes it stop? The factors that finally lead to termination.
So for you, the listener, this deep dive today is all rooted in developmental criminology.
And that field really tries to move beyond just a snapshot view of crime.
It demands what the sources call a global vision of the entire path someone takes. It's really about the journey, isn't it?
Precisely. And the science behind trying to predict and, well, explain who stays on that criminal road and who manages to find an exit ramp.
Okay, so where do we start with that journey? What's the foundation?
Well, to really get a handle on modern developmental criminology, you absolutely have to start at the beginning with the cornerstone research.
Which is?
The Gluck research. That's Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck. They started way back in the 1930s.
Ah, the Glucks. Yeah, that's classic stuff, right? Why is their work still so critical today?
It was just revolutionary for its time. It was one of the very first truly longitudinal studies. They followed 500 persistently delinquent boys.
In Boston, wasn't it?
That's right, in Boston. And they compared them to 500 non-delinquent boys over many, many years. And the crucial thing, the real innovation.
What's that?
They weren't just looking at sociological factors like poverty or neighborhood. They integrated biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors.
So things like IQ, personality traits.
Exactly. Intelligence, personality structure, family dynamics, even physical characteristics. They threw everything into the mix to figure out why some kids persisted in offending while others, just matured out of it.
And their main takeaway?
Their core finding, which still resonates, is that persistent offending is never caused by just one single factor. It's always a confluence, a coming together of multiple issues.
Okay, so the Glucks set the stage. They showed we need this holistic, multi-factor approach. Which brings us nicely to our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack the three major viewpoints, and they often compete that developmental criminologists use to explain this persistent criminal activity, this whole idea of a career in crime.
Right. They're all trying to explain the same thing, why crime persists. But their explanations for the mechanism, the underlying reason for that persistence, are fundamentally different.
So let's lay out those three models.
Okay. First up, we have the life course theories.
Life course, got it.
These theories see crime as a really dynamic process. The idea is that your tendency to offend, your propensity, is constantly changing.
How so?
Well, it's influenced by a whole multitude of individual characteristics, traits, sure, but most importantly, by social experiences that change across your whole lifespan. Things happen, and they change you.
Okay, dynamic change. What's the second viewpoint?
The second is basically the polar opposite. Latent trait theories.
Latent trait. Stable, maybe.
Exactly. The core belief here is that your development, your path, is controlled by a single, stable, pretty much unchanging master trait.
Like what kind of trait?
Could be something like low self-control or high impulsivity, something that's present really early in life, maybe even from birth, and it basically dictates your probability of offending forever. It doesn't really change.
Wow, okay. Stable trait versus dynamic process. And the third?
And finally, we've got an attempt to sort of synthesize the trajectory theories.
Trajectory, like different paths.
Precisely. These argue we don't necessarily have to choose between the first two models for everyone. Instead, they say there's more than just one single path into a criminal career.
Meaning?
Meaning there are different distinct classes, different types of criminals, and each type follows its own specific developmental route. Some might be stable, fitting the latent trait idea, while others are more dynamic, fitting life course.
Okay, that gives us a great roadmap. Life course, latent trait, trajectory. But you mentioned a core conflict, something underlying all of this.
Yes. Before we dive into the specifics of each theory, the sources really emphasize this foundational philosophical conflict. It sort of dictates which model you're likely to lean towards.
And what's that conflict about?
It really boils down to the capacity for human change. How stable is an individual's fundamental inclination, their propensity, towards crime? That's the philosophical fault line dividing the field.
Okay, stability versus change. And the sources use these two specific terms. population heterogeneity and state dependence. Let's break those down.
Right. Let's start with population heterogeneity.
Heterogeneity,
Yeah.
meaning differences in the population.
Exactly. This viewpoint assumes that the propensity, that fundamental inclination to be antisocial or criminal, is a relatively stable trait, something you basically carry with you through life.
Okay, so think of it like a person's risk level is set, maybe like a thermostat. Set low for self-control or maybe high for risk-taking.
That's a good analogy. And if you believe in heterogeneity, that setting is pretty much fixed early on. That characteristic controls your behavior, really regardless of what stage of life you're in.
So the crime itself might look different over time.
Yeah, absolutely. You might go from, say, stealing candy as a kid to maybe tax evasion or corporate fraud as an adult. The expression of the crime changes, but the underlying inclination, that propensity, it stays steady.
And the population is heterogeneous because some people just have this fixed high potential for crime and others...
Well, others don't.
That's the core idea. The population is mixed in terms of the stable trait. And think about the policy implications there.
Right. If the trait is stable, unchangeable,
then interventions probably need to focus more on controlling behavior, reducing opportunities for crime, maybe through surveillance or incarceration, because you can't really fix the person's core inclination.
Okay, that's population heterogeneity, stable trait. What's the alternative view?
The alternative is state dependence.
State dependence, so your state depends on things. Exactly.
Yeah.
It argues that people absolutely change. They develop, they mature. This view holds that life events, things like getting married, losing a job, going into the military, moving to a new city, these things have a significant influence on your future behavior.
So your tendency to commit crime isn't fixed, it's unstable.
Unstable, yes.
Right.
Subject to flux. The state you're in right now, your social environment, your job, your relationships, that depends on your recent behavior. And critically, your current behavior influences your future state. It's a feedback loop.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about how life experiences shape you as you go.
Precisely. It's about change being possible.
So let's connect this back to our three theories. Latent trait theories with their unchanging master attribute. They must assume population heterogeneity, right?
Absolutely. They rely on that idea of a stable, inherent difference between people.
Whereas the life course theories, which emphasize all these transitions and turning points in life, they have to rely on state dependence.
They have to, because their whole premise is that individuals can change their fundamental path based on these outside experiences and social interactions. Change is central to the theory.
Okay, that distinction is really clear now. Stability versus change. Heterogeneity versus dependence.
Right. And with that framework in mind, let's jump properly into the first model, the dynamic one, life course theories.
All right, diving into life course. Here, the emphasis really shifts to process, to interaction over time. Crime isn't just about the person, it's about the person in their life experiences.
Exactly. And a crucial idea here is that disruption promotes criminality.
Disruption, like what kind of disruption?
Think about major life transitions, moving from primary school to high school, going from school into the workforce, or leaving single life for a committed family situation.
Okay, big changes.
Right. And when an individual experiences disruptive failures during these major transitions, the theory suggests these disruptions can be really destructive. They can fundamentally promote criminal behavior, often because they sever positive social ties, positive connections.
That makes sense. It throws you off track.
It does. And this feeds right into that core tenet we mentioned, changing life influences.
Meaning the things that affect your behavior change as you age?
Absolutely. The factors influencing your behavior when you're, say, 7 years old, like how much your parents supervise you, your early school experiences, they're completely different from the factors influencing you when you're 37.
Yeah, like your job stability, whether you're married, paying a mortgage.
Exactly. As people mature, the specific blend of social factors, psychological factors, biological factors that shape their choices, that blend necessarily changes. This is state dependence in action.
Okay. Now, to really understand the complexity of life course, the sources say we need to grasp three key concepts it uses. The first one is problem behavior syndrome, or PBS.
Right, PBS. These are a really powerful clinical insight, actually.
What does it mean?
PBS suggests that crime isn't usually an isolated, specific issue for a person. It's not just someone who happens to steal cars, full stop. Rather, crime is often just one symptom, one element among a whole group of interrelated antisocial behaviors that tend to cluster together within that individual.
A cluster of problems, like what kind of things are in this cluster?
Well, the sources list a whole constellation of highly correlated behaviors. Things like severe family dysfunction, a history of sexual or physical abuse, substance abuse, heavy smoking.
Okay.
Also things like precocious sexuality, early pregnancy, major problems with school, educational underachievement, suicide attempts, high sensation seeking, and chronic unemployment later on.
Wow, that's a lot of interconnected issues.
It is. And the clinical significance is huge. If crime is just one manifestation of this deeper underlying syndrome of the PBS, then interventions have to be holistic. Right?
Yeah, you can't just treat the crime in isolation.
Exactly. You can't just focus on stopping the drug use, for example. You probably need to address the underlying family trauma, maybe impulse control issues, the educational failures, all at the same time. These individuals are often fighting battles on multiple fronts.
So the crime is just the tip of the iceberg, showing this deeper struggle.
That's a good way to put it. It's the outward sign of a deep internal and social struggle.
Right. It's like you're not just treating a broken arm, you're treating the systemic issue that made the bone brittle to begin with.
Perfect analogy.
Okay, so that's problem behavior syndrome. What's the second key concept within life course?
The second one addresses the nature of the criminal activity itself. It's the distinction between offense specialization versus generalization.
Specialization versus generalization. So do criminals stick to one type of crime, or do they mix it up?
Well, some offenders do seem to be specialists, statistically speaking. They might limit their activity to a fairly tight cluster. Maybe they focus only on white-collar fraud, or perhaps just on low-level shoplifting and theft. They stick to what they know or where they have access.
Okay, the specialists.
However, the life course view, and honestly, a lot of the supporting data, suggests that most serious persistent offenders are actually generalists.
Generalists, meaning they do a bit of everything.
Pretty much. They don't stick rigidly to one type of crime. They engage in a wide variety of criminal activities, maybe drug abuse, burglary, assault, fraud, whatever opportunity presents itself.
So their decision-making is more fluid, opportunistic.
Highly opportunistic, yes.
Yeah.
They tend to choose their crime based on the immediate chance, the perceived likelihood of success, rather than any kind of loyalty to a specific offense type. And this generalist tendency, you see, really underscores that idea of underlying instability that comes with problem behavior syndrome.
It fits that picture of general dysfunction.
Okay.
And the third core concept.
The third one is early onset.
Early onset, meaning starting crime young.
Exactly. It's the observation that the seeds of a criminal career, as the sources put it, are often planted very early in life. The first signs of deviance, things like persistent lying, skipping school, early aggression, they often appear well before adolescence, sometimes in early childhood.
And what's the significance of starting early?
Well, the data here is pretty undeniable. Early onset of deviance is a very strong predictor of later and usually much more serious criminality.
So the earlier you start,
the longer your criminal career tends to last, and often the more severe it becomes. This obviously results in a significantly greater cost to society over the long run.
Okay, early start equals longer, more serious career. But this observation brings up that crucial distinction you mentioned earlier, cause versus symptom.
Exactly. Is early onset the cause of the later criminal behavior, or is it just a symptom of some deeper underlying issue?
Right, if it's a cause.
Then the argument is that those early minor acts themselves, the first time a kid shoplifts or gets into fights, they start a negative process.
Right.
Maybe the child gets labeled as bad, they get excluded from positive peer groups, they start hanging out with other deviant kids, and they become entrenched in that lifestyle. So the early behavior causes the continuation through social reactions.
Okay, but if it's just a symptom?
Then that early deviance is simply the first visible sign of a deeper problem that was already there. Maybe it's that stable latent trait we'll talk about later, like low self-control. Or maybe it's severe neurological issues, or just pervasive environmental deprivation from birth.
And in that case, intervention shouldn't focus just on stopping the minor act.
Right. It should focus on identifying and addressing that underlying root vulnerability. Now, life course theorists, because they emphasize social factors, tend to give a lot of weight to the social response, to the early onset, the power of getting labeled delinquent, and the subsequent social exclusion that follows.
Okay, so the social reaction can lock you in.
That's a key part of the life course perspective. And this deep dive into how life events, transitions, and social reactions shape the path brings us directly to probably the most preeminent life course model out there.
Which is?
Sampson and Lobb's age-graded theory of informal social control.
Sampson and Lobb's, they're famous for reanalyzing the original Gloop data, right? Decades later.
That's exactly right. And their central research question, using that rich, long-term data, was beautifully simple. If we know there are different pathways into crime,
Are there also well-worn trails back to conformity?
precisely, and they argued forcefully that yes, there are paths back, and those paths are largely paved by strong social bonds that people form in adulthood.
How did they formalize that process? What are the key ideas?
They use three really interconnected concepts: trajectories, transitions, and turning points.
Okay, trajectory, transition, turning point. Let's break those down.
Your trajectory is basically your long-term developmental path. Your life history of behaviors, whether criminal or conventional, is the road you're on.
Okay, the overall direction?
Transitions are the short-term specific life events that happen along that road. Things like graduating from school, getting married, having a child, landing your first real job, maybe joining the military.
Normal life events.
Exactly. But the really critical concept for change is the turning point.
The turning point. What makes a transition a turning point?
A turning point happens when one of those important life events, a transition, produces such a significant shift that it fundamentally changes the direction of your long-term trajectory. It makes you turn off the old road onto a new one.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Getting a new job is just a transition. But getting a new job that requires you to move completely changes your daily routine, puts you under positive supervision, and connects you with a whole new pro-social peer group, steering you away from your old criminal buddies. That can be a turning point.
So it's about the impact of the event on your life structure and social ties.
Exactly. And these positive turning points, Sampson and Lobb argue, are the real key to desistance. That's the technical term for stopping criminal activity.
Okay. But life isn't always positive transitions, right? Their theory must account for the negative side, too.
Oh, absolutely. They explicitly acknowledge the harsh reality of cumulative disadvantage.
Cumulative disadvantage. Sounds like problems piling up.
That's exactly what it is. It's the compounding, cascading effect where one social problem makes another one more likely. Think about it. Early trouble in school might lead to dropping out, which leads to unstable, low-paying jobs, which limits your housing options, which puts stress on your family relationships, which leads to more instability.
It's like a downward spiral. Bad luck breeding more bad luck.
Precisely. And this spiral dramatically reduces the chances that someone will encounter or be able to seize one of those positive turning points. You're constantly starting from a deficit because every past failure makes the next transition even harder.
So how do you break out of that cumulative disadvantage spiral, according to the theory?
The key, according to age-graded theory, lies in acquiring social capital.
Social capital. That's a term you hear a lot. What does it mean in this context?
It's actually a powerful and pretty easily relatable concept. Sampson and Lobb define it as having positive relationships with individuals and institutions like family, work, school, community groups that are life-sustaining.
Life-sustaining.
Meaning they provide support, structure, opportunities, and a sense of belonging. It's basically the reservoir of trust, mutual obligation, and positive connections you build up. And this social capital gives you a stake in conformity.
A stake in conformity, meaning you have something to lose if you mess up.
Exactly. This is a great moment, actually, for you, the listener, to pause and think about this personally. What are your prime examples of social capital in your own life?
Yeah. Is it maybe the trust you've built up with your boss or colleagues over years? The structure and support you get from a religious group or a community organization? The stability and mutual support within your immediate family or close friendships?
All of those are perfect examples. Now, imagine a high-risk individual, someone with a history of offending. If they manage to acquire meaningful social capital, maybe they get into a stable, supportive marriage, or land a decent job where they feel respected, or find a mentor who really invests in them suddenly, they have something significant to lose.
Right. That stake in conformity changes the calculation.
It completely changes the rational choice calculation. Committing a crime becomes far less appealing because the potential loss, losing that good job, damaging that important relationship, disappointing that mentor is just too high.
Okay, so building social capital through positive adult bonds is the way out. And the research on this theory is strong. You mentioned the Gluck data.
Incredibly strong, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks to Sampson and Lobb's reanalysis and follow-up work with the original Gluck participants well into their later adulthood. And this leads to probably their most famous finding.
Which is?
The marriage factor.
Yes. The idea that getting married makes people stop committing crime.
That's the classic example, yeah. Sampson and Lobb found that the men in the Gluck study who managed to maintain a successful, stable marriage and became responsible parents were exponentially more likely to mature out of crime compared to their peers who remained single or had unstable relationships.
Why was marriage such a powerful turning point?
Well, they argued that marriage and parenthood created these immediate, intimate social bonds and obligations. It restructured their routines. You have to be home. You have responsibilities. It reduced their free time, reduced their contact with deviant peers, and increased informal social control from their spouse. It was a very powerful combination of factors restricting the opportunity and motivation for crime.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. Now, despite how popular this theory is and all the research support, the sources raise a pretty significant critique, don't they?
They do. We always had to consider the critiques. And the main one here revolves around causal ordering.
Causal ordering, the old chicken and egg problem.
Exactly that. Does getting married cause someone to desist from crime?
Or is it that individuals who are already maturing out, who are maybe becoming more stable, more agreeable, more responsible for other reasons, are simply the ones who are better candidates for getting married and staying married in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a really difficult problem for any longitudinal research trying to disentangle cause and effect over long periods. Is it genuine causation? Marriage changes you? Or is it just selection? Changed people get married.
And why does that distinction matter so much?
It matters hugely for policy. If the effect is mostly just selection, if stable people are just selecting stable partners, then maybe intervention policy should focus back on trying to change the individual's underlying traits or stability before adulthood.
But if it's primarily causation?
If the relationship itself actively enforces conformity and provides the turning point, then policy should focus on facilitating these positive adult transitions for high-risk individuals. Things like marriage counseling, job placement programs, housing support, helping them build that social capital, regardless of their past.
So how do researchers try to figure this out?
Well, the sources suggest you need really sophisticated longitudinal techniques. You need to look for sharp, immediate increases in stability or decreases in offending right after the onset of the transition, like right after the wedding or starting the new job. That helps strengthen the causal argument.
Okay, that clarifies the age-graded theory and its main challenge. Now, you mentioned wanting to add depth to the cognitive side of life course theory.
Yes, moving beyond just the structural bonds, we can look at social schematic theory, or SST. This theory really digs into how those negative social factors we talked about, the disruptions, the disadvantage, how they get internalized and affect how people think.
Okay, so how does SST explain that?
SST focuses on how experiencing reoccurring, persistent, and really memorable negative social events, especially things like early exposure to violence, chaos, neglect, or betrayal, how these experiences can actually blunt fundamental human tendencies.
Blunt tendencies like
our natural inclination towards sympathy, fairness, cooperation. If your environment constantly bombards you with negative signals, the theory suggests your brain effectively gets wired to expect the worst from people and situations. You become cynical, mistrustful.
And how are these experiences stored or processed mentally?
According to SST, these repeated negative social experiences get encoded into enduring mental structures they call social schemas.
Social schemas, like mental blueprints.
Exactly. They're like the lessons you learn from your environment, often unconsciously, that permanently alter your cognitive frameworks, how you interpret the world, how you predict others' behavior.
So if your childhood consistently teaches you that authority figures are hypocritical or that relationships are unreliable or that you have to fight for scarce resources?
Then you build up these schemas built around hostility, self-interest, maybe immediate gratification because you can't trust the future.
Okay. And how does that lead to crime?
When these negative schemas become really interconnected, highly structured, and habitually relied upon, they combine to form what SST calls a criminogenic knowledge structure, or CKS.
Criminogenic knowledge structure. That sounds bad.
It is. The CKS is essentially the cognitive blueprint that defaults to an antisocial or criminal response, especially when the person is under pressure.
So it's like an automated response system.
Pretty much. When an individual with a strong CKS gets stressed, maybe they face conflict, economic hardship, a perceived threat or insult, instead of defaulting to, say, cooperation, negotiation, or seeking help, the CKS compels them to respond with crime. Because crime, based on their learned schemas, seems like the only viable mechanism for self-preservation, gaining status, or getting what they need in that stressful moment.
Wow. So SST adds this really powerful layer of psychological depth to the state dependence model. It shows how the state you're in literally shapes your thinking patterns.
Precisely. It links the external world to the internal cognitive processes driving behavior.
Okay. Now, finally, within this whole life course framework, we have to talk about persistence and desistance, the continuation, and then the stopping of the criminal career.
Right. How does crime stop, according to life course views? Most perspectives on termination, on desistance, center on profound cognitive shifts and changes in identity.
So it's not just about getting a job, it's about changing how you see yourself.
Very much so. Desistance often involves a conscious, effortful process where the offender literally stops seeing themselves primarily as a criminal or a deviant. They have to actively work to construct a new, conformist identity.
Yeah.
In SST terms, they might be trying to shed that old CKS identity and build a new one.
That sounds like hard work.
It absolutely is. And when researchers study this process of desistance, they've uncovered a really fascinating and sometimes quite disturbing difference based on gender.
Ah, the gender and desistance findings. You mentioned antisocial behavior plays out differently.
Very differently, especially in terms of long-term adult outcomes. This significantly affects the life course trajectory depending on whether you're male or female.
Okay, let's break down that difference. How does early antisocial behavior tend to affect males later in life?
For males, the research shows that an early onset of antisocial behaviors, things like aggression, delinquency, reliably leads to later problems that are primarily related to work. So employment instability, difficulty holding down jobs, and also increased involvement in substance abuse.
And the aggression itself.
Early aggression in boys is typically very physical and outward. It tends to continue as physical violence and general delinquency throughout adolescence. The aggressive trajectory often remains quite overt, quite visible.
Okay. And how does it differ for females?
For females, the pathway looks quite different. Early antisocial behavior in girls often manifests later in adulthood as severe relationship problems, difficulty forming or maintaining stable partnerships, chronic depression, a much higher tendency towards self-harm and suicide attempts, and generally poorer overall physical health.
Wow. So for females, the deviance seems to turn inward more, or interrelational problems.
Exactly. It seems to be expressed much more internally, psychologically, and within the context of relationships as they mature, rather than the more externalized acting out patterns often seen in males.
So this raises that really profound question the sources highlight. Why? Why this divergence? Why are antisocial behaviors expressed so differently by gender across the lifespan?
Yeah, it's a critical question, and there are a couple of powerful explanations often discussed.
Like what?
Well, one major factor is probably socialization and how society reacts. Girls, traditionally, are often much more heavily discouraged or punished for displaying overt physical aggression compared to boys.
Right. Boys will be boys, but girls are expected to be nice.
Something like that. So this differential sanctioning might force female deviance into less overt forms, maybe relational aggression like spreading rumors or social exclusion, or into internalized forms like anxiety, depression, eating disorders. The expression of the underlying distress shifts to meet societal expectations or avoid harsher sanctions.
Okay, so socialization channels it differently. What's another explanation?
The other involves potential biological or perhaps neurochemical differences between sexes in how emotions, particularly stress and aggression, are processed and regulated. This isn't definitively proven, but it's an active area of research.
So regardless of the precise mix of causes, socialization, biology, or both, the outcome is clear for intervention, right?
Absolutely. When you're designing programs to help persistent offenders desist, you probably can't use a one-size-fits-all approach. You likely can't treat the persistent male offender, whose problems might be more rooted in physical control, external conflict, and employment, in exactly the same way you treat the persistent female offender, whose problems might be more deeply rooted in relational trauma, identity issues, mental health, and the internalization of stress.
That makes perfect sense. You need gender-responsive treatment.
Critically important.
Okay, so that dynamic, changeable, socially influenced model of the life course, it really stands in stark contrast to the next perspective we need to tackle.
Completely. We're making a full 180-degree turn now, moving towards rigidity and stability with the latent trait theories.
Right. The entire premise flips, doesn't it? From social influence driving change to some kind of internal, stable, makeup dictating behavior.
Exactly. The latent trait model argues that there's a stable personal attribute or characteristic the trait that controls an individual's inclination, their propensity to commit crimes.
And this trait is established early, maybe biological.
Often thought to be established very early in life, yes. Sometimes linked to biology or very early experiences. And the critical point is, this trait is believed to remain stable over time. It doesn't really change throughout your life. This is the absolute heart of that population heterogeneity idea we discussed.
So once that trait is set, the die is cast, essentially. Your fundamental inclination towards crime is fixed.
That's the core assertion, yes. But even within this idea of rigidity, the sources point out an important nuance. They actually classify the latent trait into two slightly different types, acknowledging slightly different potential influences.
Okay, what are the two types?
The first is the constant latent trait. This is the purest, most inflexible version of the theory.
Constant, meaning truly unchanging.
Truly unchanging, yes. This type of trait is generally seen as being influenced by deeply rooted psychological and biological conditions. Things like genetic predispositions, perhaps, or very early irreversible neurological deficits. It's really fixed.
Okay, and the second type?
The second is what they call the evolving latent trait. Now, this is a slightly softer position.
Evolving? That sounds like it changes. Isn't that contradictory?
It sounds like it, but the idea is subtle. While it's still considered a trait that becomes stable, this view suggests that the initial level of the propensity might be a bit flexible or variable early on.
Why? What influences it?
It's seen as being influenced more by early human interaction, personal relationships, contact, social associations, things like the security of your attachment to caregivers or exposure to early trauma. These early social experiences might shape the trait somewhat.
But then it stabilizes.
Yes. The key is that it allows for some input from social life in its formation, but once it stabilizes, usually quite early on, then it becomes the stable driver controlling behavior throughout the rest of life. So it evolved early, then became constant.
Okay, a subtle distinction, but still fundamentally about a stable trait driving behavior long term.
Exactly.
Now here's the big challenge for latent trait theories. If the trait is stable, if your inclination to commit crime is fixed from birth or early childhood, how do these theories explain the most universal finding in criminology, the aging out process?
Ah, yes. Crime rates peak dramatically in adolescence and early adulthood, and then they fall off sharply for almost everyone. If the desire or the propensity is stable, why does the behavior change so much with age?
Right. How do they square that circle?
The latent trait explanation is actually quite clever in how it accounts for aging out without contradicting its core premise about the stable trait.
How does it work?
It argues that it is not the propensity, not the underlying trait that changes with age. It's the opportunity structure and the stakes involved that change.
Okay, unpack that. The criminal inclination is still there, bubbling under the surface, even in older people.
Precisely. According to this view, people only appear to age out of crime as they get older because their environment makes offending harder, riskier, and less appealing.
How do opportunities decrease?
Well, as you mature, you typically take on more responsibilities. You might get married, have kids, hold down a steady job with a fixed schedule. You might move away from old delinquent peer groups. You often face increased supervision, perhaps from a spouse, an employer, or just through having more structured routines. Fewer chances to just hang out and get into trouble.
Okay, fewer opportunities. And what about the stakes?
Simultaneously, the inducements to remain straight, the things you stand to lose, generally increase with age. You have more social capital, potentially a good job, maybe a pension building up, a family reputation. The potential costs of getting caught, like a long prison sentence interrupting your established life, become much higher.
So the rational choice shifts away from crime.
Exactly. The underlying stable inclination is still there, but the rational calculation changes. Crime happens when the opportunity presents itself to someone with the underlying propensity. But as those opportunities vanish and the costs rise with age, the outward behavior naturally recedes. The trait didn't change, the situation did.
That's a very neat explanation, actually. It preserves the stable trait while explaining the changing behavior.
It is. And this perspective, this stable trait meeting opportunity, often framed within a rational choice overlay, is strongly tied to the work often summarized under the title Crime and Human Nature.
Right. The idea is that the individual who has this latent criminal propensity still makes a decision. They choose the criminal act over a conventional one when?
When, in that specific moment, they rationally weigh the immediate potential gains of the crime against the potential losses, and the gains seem more appealing or the losses less significant to them, given their underlying propensity. The trait provides the push, but the immediate act involves a situational calculation.
Okay. Now, which specific theory is the most famous articulation of this latent trait model?
Oh, by far the most famous and certainly the most influential in recent decades is Gottfredson and Hershey's general theory of crime, often just called GTC. It was published back in 1990.
GTC. Right. And they take this abstract idea of a master trait and give it a very specific name, don't they?
They do. They argue that the core latent trait, the propensity that drives all crime, is simply low self-control.
Low self-control. What does that look like?
They define it pretty clearly. It involves things like an impulsive personality acting on the spur of the moment without thinking about long-term consequences, an inability to defer gratification wanting rewards now, a preference for simple physical tasks over complex mental ones, risk-seeking, often short-tempered, insensitive to others' needs. This deficit in self-control, they argue, is the latent trait that dictates a person's likelihood of crime and also other analogous risky behaviors across their entire lifespan.
Okay, low self-control is the master trait. And GTC is very specific about where this comes from, right? What's the cause, the etiology?
Yes, they are quite explicit. They trace low self-control directly and almost exclusively to inadequate child-rearing practices.
Parenting. So it's not biological, according to them.
Their original formulation strongly emphasizes parenting. They argue these crucial practices begin or fail to begin soon after birth, and that a person's level of self-control is pretty much solidified by the age of 8 or so. After that, it's largely stable.
Okay, so how does bad parenting lead to low self-control? What do parents need to do right?
GTC argues that effective parenting, the kind that builds self-control, requires 4 key things. First, parents need to adequately monitor their child's behavior.
Okay, keep an eye on them.
Second, they need to recognize deviant behavior when it actually occurs. They can't ignore it or excuse it.
See it for what it is.
Third, they must punish that deviant behavior effectively and consistently. Not necessarily harshly, but consistently, so the child learns consequences.
Consistency is key.
And fourth, perhaps most critically, parents need to create a strong emotional attachment bond with the child. It's this bond that makes the child care about parental disapproval and allows them to internalize the parent's values and the monitoring and punishment.
Okay, monitor, recognize, punish, and bond. And if parents fail at these?
If parents fail significantly in these areas, maybe they're inconsistent, neglectful, overly permissive, or even abusive, GTC argues the child simply never develops the internal cognitive structures, the mental muscle, necessary for managing their impulses. They don't learn to control themselves.
And the sources mention this might even affect brain development.
Yes, some interpretations suggest this early failure in developing self-control might literally influence neural development, particularly in the prefrontal cortex areas responsible for executive functions. This could lead to a permanent, or at least very persistent, deficit in self-control abilities.
Which, of course, brings us right back to that classic debate in criminology.
Nature versus nurture.
Yeah. If this trait, low self-control, is locked in so early, is it purely the result of learning and environmental failure the bad parenting GTC focuses on? Or does impulsivity maybe have a biological basis to begin with?
It's a huge debate. While GTC emphasizes the environmental cause, parenting, a lot of subsequent research actually suggests that impulsivity and low self-control may, in fact, have a strong biological or genetic component.
So there might be predispositions.
Potentially, yes. Maybe linked to those executive function deficits in the brain we just mentioned. And ironically, if this biological evidence holds up, it actually strengthens GTC's core argument that the trait is stable and very difficult to change after early childhood, even if the cause isn't solely parenting.
That's interesting. Biology might support a theory originally focused on nurture. Now, what's really striking about GTC is its sheer ambition, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly ambitious. Gottfredson and Hershey claim that their single concept, low self-control, explains essentially all varieties of criminal behavior.
All of them, from like petty theft to serial murder.
Yes, and not just crime, but also all those other analogous risky or deviant behaviors. Things like smoking, drinking, drug use, gambling, reckless driving, having accidents, unstable relationships, poor job performance. They argue low self-control is the common cause behind all of it.
Wow. That's aiming high. A unified theory of crime and deviance.
Exactly. Its real strength lies in that incredible scope and breadth. It tries to be a single, parsimonious, meaning simple field theory of crime. And you can't deny its impact. It's arguably one of the most important and heavily researched criminological theories of the past few decades, with a vast amount of empirical support from studies all over the world.
Okay, it's influential, it's broad, but let's play devil's advocate for a moment, like an informed listener might be thinking.
Please do.
If low self-control is all about impulsivity, spur-of-the-moment actions, how does it explain crimes that seem highly premeditated, really planned out, and definitely not impulsive? Things like sophisticated corporate fraud that takes months to set up, or running a complex organized crime ring, or meticulously planning a bank robbery. Those seem to require a lot of control and planning, not a lack of it.
That is, without a doubt, the central challenge and most common critique leveled against GTC. How does low self-control explain high-control crimes?
So how do GTC proponents respond?
Their argument is subtle. They say that even in those seemingly premeditated crimes, the root decision to pursue illegal game in the first place, the willingness to disregard long-term consequences, the indifference to harming victims, the choice of a risky criminal path over conventional one, that decision itself is a manifestation of low self-control.
So the criminality is impulsive, even if the act is planned.
That's the essence of their argument. They'd say a person with genuinely high self-control simply wouldn't choose that criminal path to begin with, no matter how much planning was involved later. The planning might be careful, but the underlying choice to be a criminal stems from that core deficit.
It still feels like a bit of a tough sell for crimes that require intense, sustained focus and discipline, doesn't it?
It does. It remains a point of contention. And critics raise other fundamental questions about GTC as well.
Like what?
Well, first, going back to the core premise, is criminal propensity truly invariant? Does it really never change after age 8? We know from life course theories, like age-graded theory, that people do seem to make dramatic changes later in life. How does GTC account for those genuine transformations?
Okay, the invariance question. What else?
Second, there's the famous critique concerning circular reasoning or tautology.
Circular reasoning. How so?
The worry is, how do we measure low self-control independently of the crime or deviance it's supposed to cause? If we define low self-control by pointing to someone's criminal acts, and then say low self-control causes criminal acts, we haven't really explained anything. We're just using different words for the same thing.
Right. How do they try to avoid that circularity?
GTC tries to avoid it by measuring self-control using those non-crime correlates. We mentioned things like smoking, drinking, accidents, impulsivity questionnaires. The idea is if someone scores low on self-control based on those behavioral or attitudinal measures, that score should then predict their likelihood of future criminal acts, providing independent evidence. But it's still a methodological challenge.
Okay. And a final critique.
And finally, there's the ongoing debate about the true relationship between the trait and environmental factors. GTC claims the environment primarily affects opportunity, the chance to commit crime, but not the underlying propensity. Life course theories, as we saw, argue the environment fundamentally shapes the person's state and propensity over time. It's a really basic scientific disagreement about how people interact with their world.
So GTC is powerful, influential, but definitely not without its controversies and questions.
Absolutely, like any major theory.
Okay. So as you, the listener, are processing all of this, the dynamic life course versus the stable latent trait, maybe take a moment. Think about someone you know personally whose behavior, whose life has changed really dramatically over time. Maybe someone who cleaned up their act significantly, or perhaps someone who spiraled downward later in life.
Yeah, think about that person. Does the life course explanation, the idea of a changeable state that depends heavily on outside events, on turning points, seem to fit their story better?
Or does the latent trait explanation, the idea of a stable underlying propensity that was always there, just waiting for the right or wrong opportunities or circumstances to emerge, does that feel like a better fit for the dramatic change you observed? It's a fascinating lens to apply to real lives.
That thought exercise, weighing stability versus change in real people, brings us perfectly to our final synthesizing viewpoint, trajectory theory.
Right. Trajectory theory tries to bridge that gap, doesn't it? It tries to reconcile stability and change by saying maybe both are true, but for different people.
Exactly. Trajectory theory's core assertion is that there isn't just one single path to crime, and critically, there isn't just one single class of offender. It explicitly acknowledges the need for both dynamic explanations, like life course, and stable explanations, like latent trait, suggesting they apply to different groups of people following different criminal pathways.
Okay, so how does it distinguish between these different paths or types of offenders?
Well, one way is by looking closely at the timing of when offending starts and how it progresses. We can distinguish between early starters, late starters, and non-starters.
We talked about early onset with life course theory. What's the trajectory view?
The general finding holds. Those who start engaging in repeated, sustained illegal acts early in adolescence are, on average, the most likely to continue offending deep into adulthood. They often fit the profile of that high-risk, persistent group.
Okay, early start often means long career. Makes sense.
But here's the genuinely surprising fact that trajectory research highlights, something that really challenges the simple early is always worse idea.
What's that?
It turns out that the late bloomers, individuals who actually stay out of significant trouble throughout adolescence, may be only starting to offend seriously in their late teens or even early adulthood. This group is actually the most likely to get involved in really serious, high-intensity adult offending.
Really? Starting later leads to more serious crime. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? They might have a shorter overall criminal career compared to the early starters, but the intensity and severity of their crimes, once they finally begin, is often significantly greater. This suggests a completely different pathway, one that really defies that standard early onset equals ultimate severity rule.
So, what might be driving these late bloomers? It doesn't sound like a stable trait from childhood.
Probably not. Their crime might be linked more to difficulties navigating major adult transitions, perhaps sudden catastrophic job loss, a severe relationship breakdown, maybe falling into addiction later in life, or other desperate circumstances that trigger an explosive but perhaps shorter-term career of serious crime. It highlights a different mechanism entirely.
Okay, so timing matters, and late onset can be uniquely serious. What other distinctions does trajectory theory make?
It also emphasizes the heterogeneity even among chronic offenders.
Meaning not all chronic offenders are the same.
Exactly. Trajectory models are essential here because they help us categorize chronic offenders based on things like frequency and severity. We absolutely need to distinguish between, say, a very low-rate chronic offender, someone who commits maybe minor property crimes sporadically over 50 years but never escalates, and the truly high-rate chronic offender, the super predator type, who might be responsible for dozens of serious violent acts every year.
And the reasons for their persistence are likely very different.
Almost certainly. The mechanisms driving the low-rate petty thief's persistence are probably vastly different from those driving the high-rate violent offender. Trajectory models help us identify and study these distinct groups.
Okay. Are there specific models that lay out these different pathways?
Yes. One of the foundational models for thinking about different trajectories comes from Rolf Lober and his colleagues. They propose 3 distinct pathways to a criminal career.
3 pathways. What are they?
Lober suggested that a sustained deviant career tends to proceed along one of 3 different developmental routes, each characterized by an escalating sequence of behaviors.
Okay, pathway number 1.
Pathway 1 is the authority conflict pathway. This is typically the least severe path overall, and it usually starts at the earliest age, often before age 12.
Authority conflict, so problems with parents, teachers.
Exactly. It often begins with simple childhood stubbornness, just being defiant, refusing requests. This then tends to escalate into more active defiance, openly challenging parents and teachers, arguing, maybe swearing. And finally, it can culminate in serious authority avoidance, things like staying out late without permission, truancy, skipping school, or running away from home. The career here is really defined by this escalating pattern of disobedience and rebellion against control.
Okay, that's the authority conflict path. What's pathway 2?
Pathway 2 is the covert pathway. The key word here is covert, meaning hidden, sneaky. This path involves behaviors centered around stealth and dishonesty.
So not open defiance, but sneaky stuff.
Right. It often begins subtly, maybe with minor underhanded behaviors like habitual lying or perhaps very minor shoplifting that they try to conceal.
Okay. How does it escalate?
From there, it tends to escalate to property damage, like vandalism or maybe even fire setting. This signals a shift towards more destructive, but still often hidden, behavior. And finally, it can reach moderate to serious forms of delinquency, things like breaking and entering, burglary, theft over $50 grand theft, fraud, check forgery. This is often the path of the thief, the con artist, characterized by trying to get something dishonestly while avoiding direct confrontation.
Okay, covert pathway, sneaky and escalating theft damage. And pathway 3.
And pathway 3 is often the most concerning, the overt pathway. The key word here is overt, meaning open, confrontational aggression. This path is characterized by escalating violence.
How does that one start?
It often starts with relatively minor aggression in childhood, things like bullying, annoying, or teasing others persistently.
Okay, annoying kids. Then what?
This then tends to escalate fairly rapidly into actual physical fighting, getting into fights with peers, maybe gang fighting.
And the final stage?
and it can finally culminate in serious violence directed towards others. Things like attacking someone with intent to harm, using a weapon, strong arming, robbery without a weapon but with force, or even forced sexual assault. This overt pathway is often highly correlated with that group of persistent serious offenders we'll discuss next. And it's clearly the pathway that causes the most direct harm to victims in society.
So Lober's pathways show that crime isn't just random behavior. It often follows these predictable escalating sequences, and people tend to specialize in one pathway more than others.
Exactly. It adds structure to how we understand criminal development.
Yeah.
But perhaps the single most significant distinction within trajectory theory, the one that really brought these ideas to the forefront, comes from Terry Moffat.
Moffat, she made a major distinction between two main types of offenders, right?
Yes, a really sharp, clear division based on her analysis of longitudinal data. It's become incredibly influential.
What's the first group?
Moffat's first group comprises the vast majority of people who ever commit crime, the adolescent-limited offenders.
Adolescent-limited, meaning their crime is limited to their teenage years.
Pretty much, yes. They are often defined as basically typical teenagers going through a rebellious phase. Their criminal behavior is largely temporary, confined mostly to their adolescent years.
What kind of crime do they commit?
Often relatively minor stuff. Vandalism, petty theft, underage drinking, maybe experimenting with drugs. Importantly, their behavior is often seen as rebellious mimicry. They're copying the behavior of their more seriously delinquent peers to try and assert their maturity or gain status.
And what motivates them, according to Moffat?
She argues their offending is largely motivated by the maturity gap. Biologically, they're becoming adults, but socially, they're still treated like children with lots of restrictions. Crime becomes a way to claim adult status or privileges.
And what happens to them later?
Crucially, once they mature into legitimate adult roles, they finish school, get jobs, maybe form stable relationships, gain real independence. Their motivation for rebellious crime fades, and their criminal activity reliably desists. They stop. Their pathway fits the dynamic life course model perfectly. They respond well to adult turning points and transitions.
Okay, so that's the large group, the adolescent-limiteds. Who is the second group?
The second group is much smaller, but far more critical in terms of overall harm. The life course persisters, often abbreviated as LCPs.
Life course persisters, the name says it all, really.
It does. This is a small but very high-rate group of offenders. They typically begin offending at a very early age, fitting that early onset pattern we discussed.
And they don't stop in adolescence.
No, they continue to offend consistently and frequently, well into adulthood, often escalating in severity. They are the true chronic, versatile, high-frequency criminals that account for a huge proportion of all serious crime.
What makes them different from the adolescent-limited group? What's the cause of their persistence, according to Moffat?
This is the key distinction. Moffat argues that LCPs are fundamentally different. They are believed to suffer from pervasive underlying deficits, often starting with neuropsychological problems.
Neuropsychological, like brain-based issues.
Yes. These could potentially stem from inherited traits, or perhaps prenatal problems, like exposure to toxins in the womb, or maybe severe early neglect or abuse. These early deficits might result in things like lower verbal ability, poorer memory, problems with attention, and especially difficulties with executive functioning.
Executive functions? Like planning and impulse control?
Exactly. The brain's ability to plan ahead, regulate emotions, control impulses, and think flexibly. If you have deficits here from an early age, it creates enormous problems.
How do these deficits lead to persistent crime?
Moffat argues these early neuropsychological deficits cascade throughout life. They make learning difficult, leading to school failure. They make social interactions awkward, leading to peer rejection. They make it hard to hold down jobs. Essentially, these underlying deficits make it nearly impossible for LCPs to ever build positive social capital or respond effectively to potential turning points. Their environment often becomes progressively more criminogenic as a result of their own difficult behavior.
So it's a combination of underlying individual deficits and the negative environmental reactions they provoke?
Precisely. It's an interaction. So while the adolescent-limited offenders are seen as mostly reacting to social factors, the maturity gap, the LCPs are seen as being driven by these more entrenched biological and psychological vulnerabilities, combined with the cumulative disadvantage that results.
And because this LCP group is responsible for so much serious crime,
they become the true, intense focus for developmental criminologists trying to understand persistence and for policymakers trying to intervene effectively. Their propensity appears much more stable, maybe fitting that latent trait idea in some ways, but their specific developmental pathway, driven by these early deficits, is unique.
Wow. Okay, so Moffat's theory really synthesizes things by saying, look, we have these two main types, driven by different causes, following different trajectories.
Exactly. It allows for both stability for the LCPs and change for the adolescent-limiteds within the same framework.
Right. So let's try to quickly synthesize the whole picture then. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We've explored these three really powerful ways to view the development of a criminal career. First, life course theories, emphasizing dynamic change, social influences, transitions, and those critical turning points.
Then second, the latent trait theories, which really prioritize the role of a stable, unchanging personal factor, that master trait, like low self-control established early in life.
And third, the trajectory theories, which try to bring it together by asserting that there are actually different types and timings of offenders. The LCPs, the adolescent-limiteds, maybe following Lober's covert or overt pathways, meaning no single theory is likely to explain everyone perfectly.
And tying it all back to that foundational debate we started with.
Is that crucial philosophical distinction between stability versus malleability.
Yeah. Is the underlying propensity to offend fixed and stable, as the latent trait and population heterogeneity models argue?
Or is it fundamentally malleable, changeable, and subject to influence from social experiences and life events, as the life course and state dependence models propose?
And you're saying that single debate stability versus change continues to shape pretty much every discussion about crime causation and, maybe more importantly, about intervention policy today. Where should we put our resources?
Absolutely. It dictates whether we focus on early prevention aimed at traits or later interventions aimed at facilitating change.
Okay. This comprehensive understanding, exploring all these different angles, brings us, as always, to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Something to mull over long after this deep dive is complete.
Right. Let's connect some of the key insights we've discussed.
We know from Sampson and Loeb's age-graded theory that major adult life events, things like maintaining a successful marriage, securing stable employment, can act as powerful turning points. They help people build social capital and desist from crime.
And we also know from Gottfredson and Hershey's general theory of crime that, according to them at least, inadequate child-rearing practices very early on, maybe even soon after birth, can potentially lock in low self-control, perhaps even influencing neural development before a child really develops complex language.
Okay, powerful turning points in adulthood versus potentially critical windows in very early childhood.
Exactly. Now imagine society has limited resources, which it always does, and had to make a really tough strategic choice. If we had to pick one primary point in the human lifespan to invest the bulk of our societal intervention efforts, whether that's massive financial investment, intensive mentoring programs, high-quality educational support, robust family services, where would that intervention be most effective in fundamentally changing a likely criminal trajectory?
Where would you place the biggest bet, essentially?
Would you place it squarely in that very early childhood phase, targeting things like parenting support, early education, addressing potential neural development issues, trying to build self-control before that trait is allegedly locked in, as GTC might suggest?
Yeah.
Or would you place the major investment later, during those high-stakes adult transitions, pouring maximum resources into helping high-risk young adults navigate things like finding stable work, securing housing, building healthy relationships, offering intensive support, precisely when those positive turning points identified by age-graded theory are most likely to occur or fail?
It's a really tough choice, isn't it? Investing early to try and fix the potential stable trait at its root.
Versus investing later to maximize the chances for dynamic change during critical life moments, capitalizing on potential state dependence. Think about the risks involved in each strategy, the potential costs, and the potential payoffs. Where would you place that bet, considering everything we've discussed about the global vision of the criminal career?
A profound question to ponder. Thank you, as always, for diving deep with us today.